continuing our Vedanta discourses. So at this stage of the Vedanta Sutra commentary of Baladev Vidyabhushan, he talks about 6 ways of analyzing a text if it is obscure and difficult to understand. So he uses this as a way of debunking Mayavad, or the conception that ultimately the individual soul is one with the absolute truth or the Brahman. And so he gives a verse that is actually mentioned in the Shruti Sastra that talks about 6 ways of interpreting a text. Because if in a text is, sometimes they're very mysterious or not extremely direct. So he says that the Shruti Sastra itself gives a way to interpret, because there's many ways you can interpret any text. So it says if you properly interpret something, then you should you should use these tools. The first one is upakram, which means how does it start? What is the beginning of the text? I'll send this to you guys later on WhatsApp, but you can write down as well if you like. Upakram, for those who are watching online also, you can join our group, which we will mention in the comments. We're starting. We'll have a Facebook group for further kind of study and the notes about our courses and the verses we're learning, all that kind of stuff. So the first way is the upakram. You should look at the beginning of the subject matter. So if you're talking about a verse and you want to interpret the verse, how does the verse start? Then if you're talking about like a whole body of work, how does it start? Then you have the upasanghar, which means the end. How does it conclude? Then after the upasanghar, you have the abhyas. What is regularly repeated? Abhyas means, Krishna calls abhyas yoga, means the yoga of practice, which means the yoga of repetition. So what is seen to be repeated regularly? That's the abhyas. Then after that, you have the phalam, which is what is the fruit or what is the conclusion given in the text itself, generally seen. Then you have what's called apurvata. What is something that is very novel about it, unique about it, that sets it apart. Then you have the artavad, which means what is the author's own statements about its purpose. If you can find that in the work, try to understand that. Then you have what he calls artavad, apurvata, phalam, and sorry, trying to remember the last one. Upapatti. How is it? What's the ultimate appropriateness of the text? So when they deal with this verse about the 2 birds in the tree, then he uses this way of interpreting it, and he uses this to counter the Mayavad perspective. So the Mayavadis who say that ultimately the idea that we are distinct from the Brahman, absolute truth himself, is illusion. But Ved Vyas himself is establishing the fact that from the beginning, Arthato Brahma Jigyasa, what is that Brahman? Is it just the soul in its transcendental realized state, or is it distinct from the Brahman? And that's why Ved Vyas himself says the next sutra, Janma Dyasya Yata, that from which everything emanates, that which is the beginning of all beginnings, that is that absolute truth. Now, self-realization is something that helps us realize that absolute truth, but that doesn't mean we are the same as it. Self-realization is realizing that we have the same qualities as that absolute truth, and until we become what is described to be daiva, unless we develop divine qualities, we ourselves can't really understand that divine entity. That's why there's a verse in the Sastra that says, Na deva deva marchayat. Unless we develop divine qualities, we cannot understand divine personalities. So self-realization is the process of ourselves becoming not absorbed in, but shedding the layers of the false self and the gross and subtle bodies, becoming effulgently established in our true self, self-realization. Then, when we have thus become divine, then we can understand the divine source, the divine whole, the absolute truth. So self-realization is one of the steps on the stairway to Brahman realization, or realization of the absolute truth. Then even when we realize Brahman, then we can go further, Paramatma realization, Bhagavan realization, then Krishna, Radha, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So there's many layers of even Brahman realization to its highest fruition. So the point is that in the Shvetasvatar Upanishad and also in the Mundaka, but Govinda Bhasya, in the commentary by Baladev Vidyabhushan, he mentions this Shvetasvatar Upanishad verses, 4, 6, and verse 7. And it's a very interesting metaphysical verse that talks about the tree, that it gives a vague poetic idea, basically. And it says it's something that you don't generally hear, so it's novel in its own right, right? The idea is that there are two birds sitting on a tree. One of the birds is absorbed in tasting the fruits of the tree, and one of the birds is merely witnessing. The bird who is tasting the fruits of the tree is experiencing sometimes happiness, sometimes distress, sometimes anxiety, sometimes depression. It's always moving in flux through the different dichotomies or different dualities of different emotions in material existence. So the example given here is now to understand this properly. In the second verse it says that if that bird who is eating the fruit of the tree loses, pauses basically, learns to reflect, learns to inquire, and takes his attention away from the external fruits, looks within, and then also turns towards his friend, then he will become free of this anxiety and disturbance, achieve peace and tranquility, and ultimately achieve the divine abode. It said that the path to liberation will become wide open for him. So now when he interprets it, Govinda Basi himself uses those 6 ways of interpreting a verse. So the upakram, which is the upakram is the beginning. The beginning of the verse is dva supara, right? The 2 birds. So he uses this as a way of countering Mayavad, because the Mayavadis say we're ultimately one. But he says, though, the very beginning of the verse says it's 2 birds. Why wouldn't it just say 1 bird? So he's saying when the beginning is the upakram is the 2 birds, then it says upasanghar. What's the ending? So in the end of the second verse, on the end of the 3rd line of the second verse, it says anyam isham, which means the other person. So the other person is referred to. Again, it's showing the duality. First it's saying the 2 birds, and then it's ending. The conclusion is the other person. So that is the upasanghar. Then what is abhyas? What is the repeated feature of the verses? Anya. Anya again means another. Anya dev. Anya just generally means like one and then the other. So anya is repeated. That word is repeated 4 or 5 times in those 2 verses. So then you have also there are phrases like anyo snan. The other person does not eat. So he gives specific examples. It said one bird eats, the other bird does not eat. So again, duality. And then also anyam isham. When the first bird turns towards the other bird, he sees the divine personality, ultimately represents the super soul. One bird represents the individual soul, one bird represents the super soul. So when the soul turns towards the super soul, then he achieves bliss and salvation. So that's repeated. The repeated feature of the verse is anya. Okay, then we have apurvata. What is very unique? The unique feature is that it's showing the difference between the Supreme Lord and the individual soul. And without the revelation of Scripture, that would not be clear. So Scripture itself is revealing that unique knowledge of the soul's nature itself, as well as the nature of the divine entity or the super soul. It's revealing that. So that is what's unique about the text. Next is the phalam. The phalam means the general purpose of the passage, and that is Vita Sokaha. That's right in the end of the second verse. Vita Soka means freedom from lamentation. So when the first bird is always absorbed in just taking the fruits, he's absorbed in happiness and distress and lamentation. That's the symptom of the conditioned soul. That Shochanati ati sudra. We're always lamenting and disturbed. So he says when we turn towards the super soul, the supreme personality, then we become free of shoka. So that's the phal, the fruit or the conclusion. Then you have arthavad. Arthavad means look at the statements of the author himself to understand the text. So Ved Vyasdev himself is the author, and he himself is stating that no, there are 2 distinct personalities. The process of liberation means even after liberation, you don't become one with that Lord. You still have your distinct nature. But at that time, you're one in the sense that you have a loving relationship. So you are one. Like you say, a partner or pair. You say they're one pair. But that doesn't mean they're one entity, but they're a pair. They're united. That is yoga. Yoga means union. Yoga yukta. To be yoga yukta means to be united. So in that sense, they are united. So that is the arthavad means the author's own statement. So Ved Vyasdev, he's the author of all the Vedas and the Vedanta himself, and he himself is establishing this throughout many different passages, that ultimately the soul and God are distinct. And finally, there's the upapatti, And the upapatti means what is appropriate understanding, what is the logical conclusion. Like in philosophical English terms, you would say the Occam's razor, which means basically what is the most logical conclusion where you don't have to, before you accept some kind of really far-fetched conclusion, accept what is more logical. So we see duality in this world already. Like we see duality between people, what to speak of the difference between myself and the absolute whole itself. So it's not very logical to think that, ultimately I am God myself. What qualities of God do I have now? Why can I not control reality? Why can I can't even control my own mind and senses. What to speak of external reality? I cannot create even an ant. Swami Prabhupada would say, God creates everything, and yet the scientists, they say there's no God, but they cannot even create the leg of one ant. What to speak of, the entire universal creation. So in this way, Ved Vyas himself establishes the fact that ultimately Bhagavan is distinct from the soul, but we can be united in a loving relationship through bhakti yoga. And that's why bhakti is the best means of attaining the Lord. That's why even the Mayavadis have to take shelter of bhakti in order to gain the results of their practice. That's why even you'll find the Mayavadis will do Bhagavat Katha, they will do Kirtan, they will do Smaran, they will do Nam. They will follow the limbs of bhakti, but they believe it's just a means to an end. Therefore, Vishnu himself says in Chaitanya Charitamrita, the Mayavadis is as if they are kicking me on the chest. Because they are using the means that the devotees use, but then at the end they say, I don't need that. Like Gurudev gave an example, that once in Kartik, he was walking across a rocky patch of road, and he took the hand of a devotee and walked for about 10 feet, and then he took the hand and he threw it aside. He said, I don't need you anymore. The devotee was really shocked, like, what's going on? Gurudev was like really sweetly, he was like, I'm so lucky. Gurudev's holding my hand and like taking my help to go across. And then he just took my arm and he flung it and said, I don't need you anymore. The devotee was like that. And Gurudev said, this is the Mayavadis. They take the help of bhakti and guru and shastra and sadhu, and then after they think they achieve the result of it, now I am God. Then as soon as they think, now I am free from material desires and this and that, then I can become Bhagavan myself, and they reject the path, the process. And that's also shown in the Mayavad commentary by Sankaracharya called Sarirak Bhashya. In the 12th sutra that we're coming up to, there's a verse that says, Anandamayo Bhyasat, that God is always experiencing Ananda. And so Sankaracharya said, no, at this point Vyasadeva was wrong. He rejected his own guru, who's the author of all the Vedas, and he said, no, he was wrong. Actually, Bhagavan is Ananda, and he's not experiencing Ananda. And so he countered his own guru's statements, or his own Param Guru Acharya's statements. And so Gurudev gives that example as showing this is the nature of the Mayavadis. They'll take the help of their guru and the sastra and establish their own position on the basis of that, and then afterwards they'll reject it.